Welcome to the Sociology Department here at University of Nevada, Las Vegas Video Discussions. And today I'm really pleased to have with me Professor Gail Hawkes, who is a professor all the way from Australia, University of New England, and she is a professor of sociology there. My name is Barb Branson. I'm in the Department of Sociology here at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Today we are here to talk about sex. Professor Hawkes is one of the international reputed scholars of sexuality. She's the author of a number of books, including Sociology of Sex and Sexuality, which is used in a lot of classes here at UNLV. Also the author of Sex and Pleasure in Western Culture and Theorizing the Sexual Child in Modernity with Danielle Egan. So welcome to Las Vegas.
Thank you, Bob.
One of the things that I think is a good place to start talking about, we all say sex is natural, but is it?
Just the easy ones first.
Yes.
What you're saying.
Yeah, right.
Well, I think there's no real short answer to that. If you say yes, then you shut down all discussion about what we understand by sex. And if you say no, then you have to then go ahead and explain why it isn't. Because clearly at some level it is natural in the sense that it is a natural process, otherwise you and I wouldn't be sitting here and our audience wouldn't be there watching us either. So that it is a biologically natural function, if you like. But as sociologists, of course, one of the things we're trained to do is to question this idea of something is natural, because it completely shuts out any dimension of the social in that. So if we simply talk about sex in relation to the body and its functions, then I guess we can say it's natural. But as sociologists, we're all trained and are training people to think that the dimensions of our human lives are much more shaped by the social rather than the natural.
So you're saying sex is socially constructed, and I read that a lot in a lot of the literature, the social construction of sex.
Yes.
One of the things that you do in all your books that I just love is talk about sex historically. Why do you do that? What's so important about talking about sex in history?
I think that's almost, for me, that was the starting point in my work on the history of ideas about sex, because it seemed to me that if I didn't go to the past to look at the present, then all I would be doing would be going around in circles, thinking about why, for example, is women's sexuality more a focus of attention than men's? Why is it that we assume that heterosexual sex is the only sort of natural way to have sex? Any question that I began to ask myself about sex, and particularly sex and pleasure, not biological sex, really it didn't take me anywhere unless I went to the past. So it was when I began to look at the histories of sex and sexual behaviour and ideas about sex, that I began to come to ideas of questions about, or rather to produce some sort of more reasonable responses to what is often contradictory about sex in our society. So
you're saying that sex was different in other places and other times than it is now? Well,
I think we need to. I think we need to probably talk about what we mean by sex, because if we say ideas about sex rather than people having sex, then we can, again, take a more sociological and indeed historical approach to this. So if we look at the ideas about sex, how it was defined, what was considered to be sort of abnormal or sinful in some way, or important for establishing yourself as in your social position, then we need to look at ideas about sex. What values were attached to what people did sexually?
So different values were attached differently back.
Yes.
Like, give me some examples.
Oh gosh.
The
most obvious one, I think, and the one I've written about in both my books, is if we look into classical antiquity, into from about the 4th, I mean that's the period from about the 4th century BC in classical Greece, specifically Athens and the Athenian state. And in their sexual practice and what people did sexually was integrally important to how they were valued in the social structure of the Athenian state. Now, when we say people, what you actually mean is men, because nobody really particularly, although sex was stratified in relation to women, it didn't have any political significance. But in the Athenian state, what men did, those men, of course, born within the state of Athens, who had the only ones had power, what these men did sexually with their desires was very important to establish and maintain them in their ascendant state in that society.
There's a lot of talk in ancient Athens about homosexuality between men and young women. Is that the best way to understand what was happening then?
No, I think the term homosexuality is very modern. I mean, historically speaking, it didn't really emerge in any sort of in any established use until the end of the 19th century. So we're talking about like 2,000 years before then. Homosexuality would have been sort of anathematic in this period. Nobody would have considered that uses of the body outside the socially expected standing of those uses would have been divided so clearly into, if you like, normal and abnormal, or indeed criminal and permissible. Homosexuality suggests, as does heterosexuality, that we only have one direction for desires. Desires in state of heterosexuality for the opposite sex, and of course, in relation to homosexuality, for the same sex. But in Athens, in this period, it was expected that men desired both men and women, and that, but it was the context. It wasn't the direction of desires so much. It was the context within which those desires were exercised.
What do you mean, the context? They didn't just go in their bedrooms at night and
no. Well, they possibly did. But of course, that raises another dimension, I suppose, to the discussion, that when we talk about history of sex and history of ideas about sex, we are literally talking about ideas. We can't go back into history 2,000 years ago and get into people's bedrooms and see exactly what they did. Any more than, generally speaking, we can do that here now, although, of course, there's webcams and things where people, of course, you can do that. But my point was that what we're talking about when we're talking about ideas about sex is what was expected. In other words, this was normative, if you like, in the terms that we use now. What was expected that people did, rather than sometimes what they actually did. And of course, if you read Plato, especially Symposium, you will see there that because they all get drunk, it's like a dinner party where they all get drunk, these men, these typical high-status Athenian men, and they tease each other about, in various points when they've had a lot of wine, about how they say that they don't sleep with these sorts of boys or those sorts of men, but in actual fact we all know you do, so just don't pretend. So the desire, sorry.
Well, and wasn't it that like the highest ethical standard of the time was to act on your desires, or to have desire, to value desire and pleasure?
Yes,
and that was distinctly different than it is today.
Absolutely, I agree. I think that's again what was fascinated me, and why I suppose I wrote the second book as well. It was like the value attached to sexual pleasure has changed over time, very much, and that if we stay with the Greeks, I mean, it was almost an ethical. It was an ethical prerequisite to value pleasure. It wasn't the pleasure that was dangerous or sinful as it was to become with Christianity, that pleasure was actually anathematic to salvation, but was in these pre-Christian periods, pleasure was understood, was valued, was highly valued, but it was necessary, again for men, less for women, it was necessary to demonstrate that you could control these desires. So it was mastery of the self, as Foucault said. I mean, you had to control this body. But the important thing, I think, and the distinction between this pre-Christian period and the Christianity work on sexuality was that it was the reason why you could use it to demonstrate your self-mastery was because it was assumed that it could be controlled, that this desire, this bodily desires, could be controlled by the mind. So, I mean, the Christians reversed that.
Oh. So not only was homosexuality not even a concept that entered their minds, it was the fulfillment of pleasure at some level, but it was also a different way of thinking about the value of sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Absolutely. And the value specifically here was to demonstrate your capacity really as a man and your qualifications to remain in this powerful position. Because, you know, if you were to, which is what they were all talking about in Symposium, if you didn't follow the sort of the rules, if you like, or the social rules, which were to control the desires, you couldn't actually just fancy someone and grab them. You couldn't, male or female. Right. Although with females it was less significant what you did with your desires, because women really didn't have any capacity to disrupt the social order at all. I mean, they were there for sexual pleasure and for reproduction. And if they were accomplished better, that was better. But it wasn't necessary. It was these young men who were the key to all of this, and so they were the highest sort of form of eroticism, if you like. But it didn't necessarily, and often wasn't accepted that you penetrated these boys. I mean, it was the penetration, because penetration was, to be penetrated was to be dominated. And young, high-status Athenian boys had to learn to be these dominant men, and so they played with the idea of penetration. I'm sure they did actually do it, but what was permitted was what was called intracrural sex. In other words, the penis was put between the thighs, and then if they ejaculate, but better still not to, really. But a lot, I mean, this was a difference between ideas and practice, I guess, as it is today.
So that even our notions that are so wrapped up in the gender binary today were completely different then. This has been really interesting. I really want to thank Gail Hawks for chatting a little bit with us and look forward to more discussions.
Thank you.